Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today is day 1 of Unit 5.6, Industrialization, Government's Role. And we're going to be looking at the causes and the effects of economic strategies of different states and empires. And we've already really looked at Japan 2 videos ago. So today we're really going to be, starting to look at Muhammad Ali in the development of the cotton textile industry in Egypt. All right. So once again, this is another example of the way in which industrialization is brought to different places and how they vary. So obviously the story of how industrialization begins in places like England or spreads to places like Belgium and the United States is going to be different than how it eventually is established in places like Japan or Egypt or even the Ottoman Empire or in the Qing dynasty, right? Or Russia for that matter. So we've got multiple different case studies you could explore if you're looking for examples of state-sponsored industrialization. Right, so when you do look at Russia or China or Egypt or the Ottoman Empire, right, or Japan, all of these countries are similar in that the government played a major role in their industrialization. Right, however, all of them vary in that they all have different reactions within their country. Some are going to face very serious resistance to industrialization. Others are going to be able to control that a little bit better. All right, so that being said, we're going to really be talking about Egypt today. We did see some resistance to industrialization during the Meiji period. You do have a series of samurai revolts. We're not going to see that kind of resistance, and a lot of it has to do with how it all begins. So we'll get into that in a minute. Okay. Once again, just we're talking about the spread of the Industrial Revolution, and of course looking at these kind of global implications. And so we've already looked at Japan. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Egypt. All right. So let's go through this, and this is a lot. So I'm gonna read through this and then explain this kind of stuff. Right. So Muhammad Ali, right, a person that we often credit with establishing the cotton textile industry in Egypt. And of course, eventually this is gonna, right, this story of industrialization, of Egypt will end with the occupation in 1882 by the British here. So we kind of have a time frame, right? A specific time frame that we're looking at, or a window that we're looking at. So Muhammad Ali, right? He emerges as a leader of Egypt in 1905, following the invasion by Napoleon in 1798. Right. So Napoleon is simply a military leader for France at this point. And they're sent to, or he is sent to Egypt, where he successfully, takes control of Egypt, and eventually, he himself will push up to what is today Syria and leave, and the French troops will be withdrawn in 1801. And when you look at this, and just kind of as an aside note, if you look at, there's a AP World textbook out there. I've got older versions of some of these textbooks, but the bullet textbook. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, there's an interesting excerpt in the bullet textbook. Some writings from Napoleon while he is in Egypt. And it is pretty interesting to kind of hear him talk about Islam. It's kind of if you're interested in kind of that kind of topic, it is definitely an interesting read. All right, so anyway, Napoleon withdraws, and the Ottomans are gonna send Muhammad Ali into Egypt in order to restore Ottoman control. And this is one of those kind of little contextual parts here is, who did Napoleon actually defeat when he goes to Egypt? Is he actually defeating the Ottomans? And the answer is probably not, right? The Mamluks, whom the Ottomans had defeated in the early 1500s to get control of Egypt. The Mamluks had reasserted control as the Ottoman Empire was beginning to, their force or their power in that area had begun to fade. So the Mamluks had kind of reestablished themselves as in control of Egypt. So the French will come in, defeat the Mamluks there. And then once the French are gone, the Ottomans decide this is a good time to reassert their control. So Muhammad Ali himself is actually Albanian, right? He's from Southeast Europe. So he is sent and sent to restore control there, right? So he will successfully restore control, right? And we've already talked about that in previous videos, right? So what he does, and then eventually he moves on and reasserts Ottoman control over the Arabian Peninsula, right? And so Ottomans will kind of regain control of Mecca again, and around the end of the 18 teens, right? A real bloody fight against by Muhammad Ali, against the Sauds. But anyway, we talked about that back when we were looking at Wahhabism, all right, and the rise of Wahhabism within Islam. Right, but that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about modernization. So once Muhammad Ali himself asserts control over Egypt, you're going to see a modernization focusing largely on military, military control, economic growth, and of course dispossession of the Mamluks, of their land and their privileges. So if you can, kind of use the process of industrialization to weaken your enemies, then that's an added benefit here, right? So what do we see here is under the rule of Muhammad Ali, and notice we're not really saying under the rule of the Ottomans again, right? So the Ottomans will send Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali functions pretty independently within the highly decentralized Ottoman state. Okay, so Muhammad Ali will encourage farmers to grow cash crops such as cotton, and you're going to see the rise of a single buyer system, right, or a monopsony, and a single buyer system is all you really need to kind of reference this. So what does this mean? That means all cotton and of course later all grain is going to be put in this. All cotton and all grain grown in Egypt is going to be sold to the government, right? The government, Muhammad Ali's government, is that single buyer. And then they are the ones who will then distribute it, right? Sell it. And, right, so they get to establish the price that they're going to be buying the grain from, right? So if you don't have competition who's buying your products, that means, whoever has that monopoly, on buying it, they're the ones who get to dictate the prices. So the Egyptian government gets to dictate prices, right, for grain and cotton from the farmers, and then they resell it, as a commodity at market price outside of Egypt. So, and this becomes a really big deal because all the profits will then not go to the farmers or the landowners. All the profits then go to the government. And this ends up being a very important thing in these early years of Muhammad Ali, because grain prices were really, really high as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. So the Napoleonic Wars are running, from the time that Muhammad Ali comes to power, in through the, the Russian campaign is in 1812 into 1813. Napoleon comes back again in 1815. So really until 1815, you've got a lot of years of very high grain prices as a result of the Napoleonic Wars and the turmoil that comes as a result, right? And then from 1816, you're going to see Egyptian students being sent to Italy and France and and England, right? Very similar to what we see with the Japanese, right? Sending out people to learn, when they go through this process. And the military becomes the model for the Egyptian army, and the French military. So the Napoleonic artillery corps, Napoleon's infantry. That is what becomes the model for Muhammad Ali's military. And the military schools included conscription, built factories to supply the army, and really after 1815. You're also going to see a number of former officers of Napoleon's army. They're going to go to Egypt to teach in these military schools. So their officer training corps, right, isn't just modeled after the French. They're using the French as advisors. And you also kind of read of stories of some of these French officers, going as far as South Asia. To train artillery corps, right, in South Asia at this time. Right, but we see this military, right, once it gets established, and educated and armed and trained, they're going to start moving, right? They're going to start to go into use, and in 1821, we're going to see Egypt moving to the south and taking control over the Sudan. So. And this will actually come up later on in the next unit when we talk about some of the Mahdist revolts, right? So, but Egypt gets control of this region in 1821. All right. We also see that military being used as well. Try to make this bigger. We also see this military being used as well in 1826. When Egypt supports the Ottoman Sultan forces during the Greek War of Independence. They will not be successful, however. And England does play a role in that lack of success. The British Navy does play a role in Greek independence, right, in that story. And I think we'll reference that later when we get into the Ottoman Empire. Right. So here's just an infographic looking at early adopters of Western science, right? In Egypt and Japan are both identified on here. All right, so countries, yes. All right, and of course, looking at, I have a hard time keeping these things up here today. Right, simply looking at Ottoman control here, Ottoman influence at its peak in 1814. Around this time, right? So, but we're really identifying this as something that is, under the Ottoman sphere, but independent in its own right. And I say that because, right, what happens later? So, in 1839, Muhammad Ali's son, right, Ibrahim, he himself will invade Syria and begin to push towards Istanbul, right, until European powers will intervene. So. Right, we see an actual move by Muhammad Ali's son Ibrahim, to push an army towards the north, headed towards Istanbul, a move to knock out the Ottoman Empire. But that move, which may have been successful, that move was stopped or thwarted by the British. So the British will, their navy will bombard the Egyptian-held cities in Syria, and will then force them to withdraw. So we see the British, intervening in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire here, as early as 1840. They definitely had already intervened in the Greek revolution, of the Greek independence movement. And then in the Greeks, in that case, the British intervened on the side of the Greeks. And help them win their independence, and because of naval actions. And we're seeing the same thing here, just, in this case here, though, the British are deciding that the Ottoman Empire is a necessary thing, and didn't want the Egyptians, right, taking them over. So, so we do see an intervention here. We also see the British at this point placing limitations on Egypt. So Egypt is forced by the British to reduce the size of its army and its navy, to end this single buyer system that existed. So allow farmers, right, who grow cotton and grain and those kinds of things, to sell it on the open market, right, to sell them on the commodities market or sell them at commodity prices, and then forced to allow Europeans to undertake business ventures. So Egypt lost the right to control, whether or not foreigners from England or France specifically could come in and start businesses. Right, so you have to allow foreign business owners. And these are pretty dramatic. Can you talk about unfair treaties, which we talked about in regards to Japan, and when we contextualize China, this is just another example, right? Specifically, that last one, right? So in 1851, the first railroads are going to begin. So you are going to start to see, the industrial infrastructure expanding here. And then from 63 to 79, you're going to see a westernization push take place in Egypt. Of course, in 69, we have the Suez Canal wraps up and is completed. And then for, reasons we've already talked about before, which I think we talked about it within this context, because of the debt accrued by the Egyptians to build the Suez Canal, the debt they owed to France and England, as well as the debt that they had taken out in order to build the infrastructure to transition their economy to a more cotton-based economy, because to take advantage of the rise in prices that happened as a result of the U.S. Civil War, right, they go from a small supplier of England to cotton to a large supplier. Because of that debt that they acquired, in order to build that infrastructure, the irrigation canals and the such for cotton production, you're going to see in 1882, England will eventually come and occupy Egypt once they have defaulted, right, on those loans, because of course the price of cotton will drop once the United States comes back online as a supplier of cotton, right? So talked about that already in a previous video. All right, but what we haven't really kind of talked about here is the Suez Canal. We mentioned it yesterday. You kind of watched a quick little video clip in the last video, but right. So we see this process of westernization take place in Egypt under Ishmael, and right, the Suez Canal, the cotton infrastructure development, right, and by 1875. Right, so kind of going into all this, because of the debt acquired because of the Suez Canal and because of the debt from the high interest rates as they had transitioned to cotton during the 1860s, by 1875, Egyptian government was forced to sell its shares in the Suez Canal. Right, so Egypt lost control of the Suez Canal to England. Right, so from 1882 up until 1956. England will officially have control of Egypt, in the Sudan, and and technically the Suez Canal until 56. You are going to see, and I think that's maybe a little misspeak here. That's really referring to the Suez Canal. Egypt will transition, right, starting in the 1930s, and then into the early 1950s. But Gamal Nasser, right, will eventually take back the Suez Canal in a very dramatic series of events in the mid 1950s. Right, but the Suez Canal is, of course, very, very important, and we referenced this yesterday in the video because of the shipping time. This makes a ton of difference for the British that they now have direct control over this. And they are, and you can kind of see the difference in time, right? Just because of the mileage difference that it's going to make, right? And once again, we're not going to watch that video, but just kind of revisit that information, right? Revisit that information. If I can get that thing on the bottom to go away, there we go. Right. So yeah. So the Suez Canal is kind of part of this bigger story as well. All right, that's really it for today. Tomorrow we're going to be working with these documents, probably doing an SAQ on this. But if this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about yesterday, is part of the second industrial revolution isn't just steel and chemicals and electricity and precision machinery, but it's also major innovations and changes in communication and transportation, which have implications on trade and migration. And, so the rise of the telegraph and the locomotive, or in this case here, we're looking at steamboats, right? And, right, this is, if you look at this, the approximate number of shipping vessels and percentage of world trade by region. And you can see here, kind of well into the second industrial revolution, you can see where different parts of the world were in regards to sailing vessels versus steamships versus percentage of world trade. And you can try to draw some connections there. Okay. But so yes, we'll be kind of looking at that tomorrow in tomorrow's video. All right. All right, so internal factors, right, cause some states to initiate state-sponsored industrialization. And if you're looking at the case of Egypt, the Mamluks themselves are going to be one of the factors which will cause Muhammad Ali to create this single buyer system. And of course, external threats caused some states to initiate this, right? And of course, this is one of the big reasons why the Japanese, will sponsor this, right? So the role of the government and the economy of Japan and Egypt and China and Russia and the Ottoman Empire, they all differ greatly, right, than what we see in Western Europe and the United States. And if you want to start getting into complexity, then be able to distinguish the differences between these different state-sponsored examples. All right, that is it for today. So, Sapriati.